You're looking at a real photograph. 1956. A tunnel, lined in steel, packed with amplifiers and tape machines. Buried in the dirt beneath communist East Berlin, American and British spies dug it a quarter of a mile, straight under the most dangerous border on Earth, to wiretap the Soviet army. It is the boldest operation of the early Cold War, and the enemy knew about it before the first shovel ever touched the ground. This is the story of Operation Gold, how the West built an impossible machine to listen to its greatest enemy, and how one man at the planning table had already handed the blueprints to Moscow. The question that still hasn't been answered: was any of it real? 1945. The war ends, and the winners carve Germany into four. Berlin sits 100 miles inside the Soviet zone, and the city itself is split four ways: American, British, French, and Soviet. One city, two worlds, pressed against each other with the lights on. By 1949, it is the spy capital of the planet. Every doorway hides a watcher, every cafe table, a handover. And both sides are desperate for the same thing: to know what the other is about to do. Then the Soviets do something that blinds the West completely. They stop trusting the airwaves. They move their most secret military traffic off the radio and down onto buried telephone cables. Overnight, Western intelligence goes deaf. And this was no ordinary city. Months earlier, Stalin had blockaded Berlin, trying to starve its western half into surrender, and a round-the-clock airlift had barely kept it alive. Both sides stood one misstep from war. But the British have done this before. In Vienna, under cover of import shops and a quiet railway warehouse, MI6 had already dug short tunnels to tap the Soviet lines running through the city. It worked. So the same question forms in two minds at once. If it works in Vienna, why not in Berlin? The American is Bill Harvey, a heavy-set, hard-drinking former FBI man who carries a pistol everywhere and trusts almost no one. CIA's Berlin-based chief. They will come to call him America's James Bond. The Briton is Peter Lunn, the quiet spy master behind the Vienna tunnels. Late 1953 London, the two services sit down together and agree to the most ambitious wiretap ever attempted. The CIA calls it Operation Gold. The British call it Stopwatch. In January 1954, the director of the CIA signs off. The dig is on. But there is a man in that room nobody is watching closely enough. His job is the most boring one at the table. He takes the minutes, every decision, every measurement, every map. His name is George Blake. London, the winter of 1954. A city of 8 million. Red buses, wet pavements, 100,000 faces. The perfect place to pass a secret and vanish into the crowd. 3 years earlier, captured during the Korean War, Blake had quietly changed sides. He is a Soviet agent, and the notes he is writing, the complete plan for the tunnel, he is copying word for word for the KGB. And in the winter of 1954, on the top deck of a London bus, George Blake hands his case officer everything. The Soviets now know about the tunnel before a single shovel has touched the dirt, which leaves Moscow with an agonizing choice: warn the army and protect their own secrets, but risk exposing the most valuable spy they have inside British intelligence. So they make a cold decision. They will let the Americans dig, they will let them listen, and they will say nothing. The plan is audacious. From a patch of American-held ground in the south of the city, they will tunnel east, under the border, under a Soviet street, to 3 cables buried beneath a road in Altglinica. First, the cover story. The army throws up a warehouse at the edge of the sector, bristling with radar antennas, just a dull little listening post. Underneath it, they dig a basement far deeper than any warehouse could ever need. That is where the real work begins. Then they go down and they go across. 3,000 tons of soil, hauled out in secret and hidden so the spoil pile never grows. Rings of steel hold back the earth. The tunnel runs a quarter of a mile, 3 meters beneath the feet of East German citizens who never hear a thing. At the far end, they build a tap chamber, packed with sandbags, sealed behind a steel door built to resist a cutting torch. They even air-condition the tunnel, because the heat of the equipment rising through the ground would melt the frost on the road above and draw a perfect line pointing straight down at them. And there they are, 3 Soviet cables, lead-sheathed, lying less than half a meter under the surface, carrying the phone calls and teletype of the Soviet military, the KGB, and the GRU. British technicians clamp on the taps. May 1955, the West starts listening. Beneath every city, the world's secrets traveled as current down buried wire. Reach the right cable, unseen, and you could hear all of it. And above it all, life simply goes on. Trams, shoppers, children on the pavement. Ordinary East Berliners, with no idea that 3 meters beneath their feet, the West is listening to everything. What comes back up the tunnel is a flood. Banks of tape recorders run around the clock, 150 of them, swallowing every conversation on the lines. 50,000 reels of tape, hundreds of thousands of conversations, 40,000 hours of phone calls, and 6 million hours of teletype. More than the West could hope to process in years. Drinking from that fire hose took a small army of its own. 300 Russian and German linguists, racks of machines running in shifts an ocean away. And the take is gold. Soviet troop movements, officer postings, the inner workings of the entire Red Army in Germany. For 11 months, the West has its ear pressed directly to the enemy's nervous system. Then in the spring of 1956, the rain comes. Berlin floods. And on the night of April 22nd, a Soviet signals crew appears on the Alt-Glienicke road, digging, they say, to repair storm-damaged cables. They dig straight down onto the tap chamber. A Soviet officer drops into the tunnel and walks its length, down to the sandbag wall in the steel door, marked in English with a warning to keep out. On the other side, the Americans hear them coming and quietly pull back. What happens next is pure theater. The Soviets summon the world's press into the tunnel. Photographers from the West are walked through the marvel the imperialists built under socialist soil. It is a propaganda triumph. The headlines are enormous, and not one of them knows the most important fact of all. Because the West still believes the tunnel was found by accident, the terrible truth that the Soviets had known from the very beginning is still locked inside one man, sitting quietly in London. It takes 5 more years. In 1961, a Polish defector hands the West a list of Soviet agents, and on it is George Blake. He confesses. The man who took the minutes had betrayed not just the tunnel, but operation after operation, and, by some accounts, the lives of dozens of Western agents. At the Old Bailey behind closed doors, they sentence him to 42 years, the longest sentence in modern British history. 1 year, it was said, for every agent he was believed to have betrayed. He serves only 5. In October 1966, George Blake climbs from a window of Wormwood Scrubs prison, goes over the wall on a rope ladder, and vanishes. Weeks later, he surfaces in Moscow, where he will live, a decorated colonel of the KGB, until 2020. He dies at 98, having outlived almost everyone he betrayed. Which leaves the question this whole story has been circling. If the enemy knew from day one, was Operation Gold the greatest wiretap in history, or an elaborate trap feeding the West 11 months of lies? Here is the twist almost no one expects. To protect Blake, the KGB never told their own military the lines were tapped. So the Soviet army kept talking, honestly, for 11 months. The intelligence wasn't fake, it was real. The Soviets simply chose to let their enemy listen, rather than give up their spy. A genuine triumph the enemy allowed, a betrayal that protected itself by working perfectly. Today, a rusting section of that tunnel sits in a museum in Berlin, the last piece of the strangest wiretap ever built. So you decide, Goldmine or trap? Tell us below. The top reply picks our next file. Anything strange, unsolved, or unbelievable. And if you want the full deep dive on this case, our WTF Files Deep Dive podcast episode is linked below. You've been watching a WTF Files production. We'll see you in the next